Welcome to Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
We're starting today with what might be one of the biggest, most fundamental questions you can ask about all of human history.
It's a question that feels almost dangerous to ask in some ways.
It is, because if you get the answer wrong, you end up in some very dark places. You end up with racist ideologies, eugenics, really the worst things humans have ever done to each other.
But if you get it right,
Well, if you get it right, it completely changes how you see the world around you, even the ground you're standing on. It reframes everything.
and we're not talking about, small historical details here. We're not asking who won a specific battle or why a king did a certain thing.
Oh, no. This is the big picture, the architecture of the modern world. The core mystery we're diving into is, why did history play out so differently on different continents?
Right. I mean, why did the world end up looking the way it does today with an incredible imbalance of wealth and power?
Exactly. If you just take a snapshot of the world in, say, 1500, you're looking at a massive disparity. On one side of the planet, you have Eurasian societies with steel, with guns, with ocean-going ships, printing presses.
All this advanced technology.
And on the other side, in the Americas, in Australia, you have societies that were often just as complex culturally, just as creative, but they were still working with stone tools.
And that technological gap it had fatal consequences. It decided who conquered whom.
It's the whole ball game. It's the reason European ships landed in the Americas and not the other way around. Why didn't Aztec fleets sail up the Thames? That's the real question.
For centuries, the answer that Western civilization gave itself was, it was a very self-serving one.
It was a story about merit, wasn't it? The idea was that, Europeans must just be biologically superior, more intelligent, more inventive, maybe even morally better.
The great man theory of history, but just applied to an entire continent of people.
Precisely. And that's the perception we're here to dismantle today. We are going deep into Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel.
It's a huge book, a classic of this kind of systems-level thinking.
It's a titan, yeah. And it basically argues that we have been looking at this all wrong. We've invented this idea of a historical meritocracy when what we should have been looking at was geography, pure environmental luck.
So there's the crisis in perception. We see what looks like differences in human talent or culture, but we're actually just seeing the end result of environmental advantages compounding over thousands of years.
We're looking at the machinery under the floorboards of history. We're going to talk about wheat. We're going to talk about why you can't ride a zebra, the actual shape of the continents, and the terrifying math of viruses.
Okay, before we dive in, just a quick disclaimer is probably in order. This is an impartial report on the mechanisms described in the book.
Right.
So when we talk about conquest, or why one group displaced another, we're analyzing the how. We're looking at the structural reasons, not making a moral judgment or trying to justify the outcome.
It is absolutely about explanation, not justification. That's a critical distinction.
Okay, let's get into it. To really grasp this theory, we have to start where Diamond starts. And it's not in a library or a university, it's on a beach.
A beach in New Guinea, July 1972. Diamond is there doing his original work as an ornithologist, a biologist studying bird evolution. So he's out there, trekking through the jungle.
And he's walking with a local man, a politician named Yali.
And Yali isn't just some random guy. He's described as incredibly charismatic, energetic, just this insatiably curious and intelligent person who's seen his world turned upside down by outsiders.
And Yali turns to Diamond and asks this question that just cuts through everything. It's so simple and yet so profound.
Yeah, he asks, why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own?
Cargo, let's unpack that word because it's so important.
It's everything. In the local pidgin language, cargo means all the material goods of the Western world. Steel axes, clothing, medicine, soft drinks, matches. To the New Guineans, this stuff just appeared on ships as if by magic.
It was power. It was technology they could see was useful, but had no idea how to create themselves.
Exactly. Yali was asking about the root cause of global inequality. He knew his people had been living there for 40,000 years, and 200 years ago they were using stone tools. Diamond's ancestors, meanwhile, were building massive empires with steel. Why the gap?
And the unspoken answer, at least in the West for a very long time, was race.
Yes. The implicit and often very explicit assumption was that it must be some kind of biological difference, that European brains were just better, more evolved.
For Diamond, as a biologist, he completely rejects that.
He does, and not just on principle. He rejects it based on his own observations in the field.
What did he see?
He writes that, in his experience, the New Guineans he worked with were, on average, more alert, more curious, more intelligent than the average Westerner he knew.
That's a pretty bold claim. Does he have a theory as to why?
He does, and it's a pretty grim, systemic one. It comes down to natural selection.
How so?
Well, think about life in Europe for the last few thousand years. You're living in dense, crowded societies. What's the main thing that's going to kill you before you have kids?
Disease.
Epidemic disease, the plague, smallpox, influenza. So for generations, Europeans were selected for their immune systems.
Cow.
If you had the right body chemistry to survive smallpox, you passed on your genes, even if you were, a bit slow on the uptake.
Okay, I see where this is going. What about in New Guinea?
Life was different, lower population density, so epidemics weren't the main killer. The main causes of death were tribal warfare, accidents, murder, starvation.
So survival depended on being smart.
On being constantly alert, on knowing the jungle like the back of your hand. If you weren't intelligent and observant, you made a mistake and you died. So he argues that the selective pressure for intelligence was arguably stronger in New Guinea than in Europe.
So if we take innate intelligence completely off the table, if we assume that a baby born today in London and a baby born in a Stone Age tribe have the exact same cognitive potential, we're left with a huge mystery. What explains the enormous gap in outcomes?
And that's where he lays out the book's central thesis. The idea is that history followed different courses for different peoples because of differences in their environments, not because of any biological differences in the people themselves.
That is a massive claim. It's basically saying geography is the primary driver of history.
It is. The problem is, how do you prove it? You can't just, run a simulation of Earth and change the variables.
Well, you can't, but Diamond argues that history actually ran a natural experiment for us.
It did. The colonization of the Pacific Islands. Polynesia.
This is the perfect test case.
It's a perfect microcosm of the whole theory. You have one ancestral group of people, the Polynesians, who start from a single point of origin.
So they have the same genes, the same culture, the same language, the same technology package. They've got their domesticated pigs, their chickens, their taro.
The starting conditions are identical, the input is controlled, but over centuries they spread out and settled on islands with wildly different environments.
And he focuses on two extreme outcomes of this expansion: the Chatham Islands and New Zealand.
Right, so let's look at the Chatham Islands first. A group of Polynesians land there maybe 500 years ago. What do they find?
It's cold, subpolar almost,
Yeah.
isolated.
Yeah, it's way south of New Zealand. And critically, it's too cold for their tropical crops. The taros, the yams, the bananas they brought with them on their canoes, they just won't grow.
So these people who came from a long line of farmers are forced to give it up.
They have to. To survive, they have to revert to being hunter-gatherers. They live on seals, shellfish, birds, and local plants.
And being a hunter-gatherer on a small, isolated island puts a very firm cap on your population size.
A very hard ceiling. They could only support about 2,000 people. And because it's a small, fragile group, they can't afford internal conflict.
A war would wipe them out.
It would be suicide. So they developed this strict code of nonviolence, the law of Nunuku. They resolved disputes peacefully. They became egalitarian because there was no food surplus to create chiefs or bureaucrats. They became the Moriori people.
So a peaceful, small, technologically simple society shaped entirely by the constraints of their new home.
Exactly. Now you contrast that with their cousins who kept sailing and landed in New Zealand.
Which is a totally different environment.
A completely different world. New Zealand is huge, it's warmer, it's much more varied. And crucially, it was suitable for their agriculture.
They could grow their crops.
They could grow their sweet potatoes, which flourished, so they could build permanent villages. They could generate and store food surpluses. And their population just exploded.
How big did it get?
Over 100,000 people. And with that density comes competition. They split into different tribes, constantly fighting over the best farmland.
And with fighting comes specialization.
Absolutely. They developed a fierce warrior culture. They built elaborate forts on hilltops called pa. They had specialized craftsmen making weapons. They had chiefs and a complex social hierarchy. They became the Maori.
So you have the exact same ancestral people, but the environment forges them into two completely different societies.
Yeah.
One, a small band of peaceful hunter-gatherers. The other, a dense, warlike society of farmers.
And then the natural experiment reaches its tragic conclusion, the collision.
What happened?
In 1835, a group of Maori from New Zealand get access to a European sailing ship. They load it up with about 900 warriors armed with guns, clubs, and axes, and they sail to the Chatham Islands.
Oh, no.
The Moriori see them land. They hold a council and decide to stick to their code of peace. They offer to share their resources, to live together.
And the Maori response?
They just fell upon them. It was a slaughter. They killed and ate hundreds, enslaved the survivors. Within a few decades, the Moriori culture was effectively extinct.
That's a horrifying story. But the systemic takeaway here isn't about good versus evil.
Not at all. The Maori weren't genetically more aggressive. The Moriori weren't genetically more peaceful. The Maori won because their environment allowed them to develop the technology, the population density, and the social organization of a conquering people.
While the Moriori's environment forced them into a structure that was completely vulnerable to that kind of society.
Exactly. If you could rewind time and swap the initial settlers, the outcome would have been reversed. The people who landed in New Zealand would have become the Maori. The people on the Chathams, the Moriori, geography shaped their destiny.
Okay, so that's the principle in a microcosm. Now we have to scale this up to the entire planet to answer Yali's question. We need to understand why Eurasia became the world's New Zealand and why other continents became, in a sense, the Chatham Islands.
And it all begins with one fundamental thing, what Diamond calls farmer power.
We all have this intuitive sense that farming is better than hunting and gathering, but Diamond really breaks down the math of it. Why is a single farmer so much more powerful than a single hunter?
It's pure calorie per acre math. I mean, think about walking through a wild forest. How much of what you see around you can you actually eat?
Almost nothing. Bark, leaves, wood, inedible roots.
Right. Most of the biomass is useless to a human. A hunter-gatherer has to cover a huge area to find enough calories to survive. It's incredibly inefficient.
Yeah, the farm.
A farm is the opposite. You've cleared away all the inedible stuff and replaced it with plants that are almost 100% edible human food. A wheat field, a cornfield. The result is that 1 acre of farmland can support 10 to 100 times more people than 1 acre of wild forest.
So just on population numbers alone, the farming society has a massive advantage from the start.
A massive demographic advantage. But it gets even better for the farmers because they're sedentary. They stay in one place.
Which affects the birth rate. This is the sedentary multiplier.
It's a huge multiplier. Think about a nomadic hunter-gatherer mother. She's constantly on the move. She can only carry 1 infant at a time.
So she can't have another baby until the first one is old enough to walk and keep up with the tribe on its own.
Exactly. So birth intervals are spaced out to maybe every 4 years. You just can't manage 2 infants while you're foraging. But a farming mother lives in a village. She can have a baby every 2 years.
So the population of the farming society isn't just denser, it's growing twice as fast.
It's an explosion. This is the demographic engine that fuels conquest. But it's not just about having more bodies, it's about what those bodies can do. And that brings us to surplus.
That's stored food.
This is the key that unlocks everything else. A hunter-gatherer group kills an animal, they eat it, there's no long-term storage. But a farmer harvests the field of wheat, and he can store that grain in a silo for years.
It's like a battery of calories.
A battery that can power a complex society. Because once you have a food surplus, you can afford to feed people who do not produce food themselves.
This is where specialization comes from.
This is everything. You can feed a king to organize society. You can feed bureaucrats to manage the food stores and collect taxes. You can feed priests to create a unifying ideology. You can feed artisans and metalworkers to create new tools.
And most importantly, you can feed a professional army.
Professional soldiers, people whose only job all day, every day, is to train to kill other people. A hunter-gatherer is a part-time warrior at best. A soldier from a farming state is a specialist.
Diamond calls this the rise of the kleptocracy. The elite essentially gain control of the food surplus and use it to fund wars of conquest.
Right. It's the transition from egalitarian bands to tribes, then to chiefdoms, and finally to states. It's a feedback loop. Food surplus allows for a state, and the state uses its power to acquire more land to produce more food surplus.
Okay, so the chain of causation is clear. Farming allows for dense populations and food surplus. That surplus allows for specialists and political hierarchy. And those specialists, soldiers, blacksmiths, kings, are the ones who conquer other people.
That's the core mechanism.
Which leads to the absolute critical question of the whole book. If farming is this powerful, why didn't everybody just do it?
Right. Why did people in the Fertile Crescent start farming around 8500 BC, but Aboriginal Australians never did? Was it a failure of imagination? Were they just not clever enough to figure it out?
And Diamond's answer is a definitive no.
It wasn't a failure of the people, it was a failure of the local flora and fauna. It's not that they didn't want to farm, it's that their environment gave them nothing worth farming.
This is where he introduces one of my favorite concepts from the book, the Anna Karenina principle.
Yeah, it's such a brilliant analogy. It's from the opening line of Tolstoy's novel. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way.
Meaning that for a marriage or a family to be happy, a whole bunch of things have to go right. You need mutual attraction, shared values, agreement on money, good in-laws, everything. If just one of those things is broken, the whole enterprise fails.
And Diamond says it's the exact same for domesticating a wild animal. Of all the thousands of mammal species on Earth, why have we only domesticated a handful?
The big ones are what? The big five: cow, sheep, goat, pig, and horse.
Those are the major ones, yeah. And he says for a wild animal to be a candidate for domestication, it has to pass a strict 6-point checklist. And if it fails on even one of those points, it's out. It can't be done.
Okay, let's go through the checklist because this is where the geographic lottery really becomes clear. What's the first test?
First is diet. It has to be an efficient herbivore or omnivore. You're not going to domesticate lions because you'd have to farm gazelles just to feed your lions. The energy conversion is a total loss. You need an animal that eats something humans can't, like grass.
Makes sense. What's number two?
Growth rate. It has to grow up fast. A gorilla is a big plant eater, but it takes 15 years to reach maturity. No Neolithic farmer has the time or resources to invest in that. You need something like a pig or a cow that's ready in a year or two.
Okay, diet and growth rate. Third.
Captive breeding. This is a surprisingly huge barrier. A lot of animals just will not mate if they're in a cage or being watched.
He gives the example of the cheetah, right?
The cheetah is the perfect example. Ancient Egyptians and Assyrian kings loved cheetahs. They kept them, tamed them, used them for hunting, but they never domesticated them.
Why not?
Because cheetahs have this incredibly elaborate courtship ritual where the males have to chase a female for days across miles of open savanna to trigger her ovulation. You can't replicate that in a zoo or a palace courtyard, so every single cheetah had to be caught from the wild as a cub. You could never start a captive breeding population.
Wow. Okay, fourth on the list is disposition. The don't be a jerk rule.
Basically, yeah. The animal can't be incurably vicious. This is the one that explains so much about Africa. Why didn't Africans domesticate the zebra? It's right there. It looks like a horse. Why no African cavalry charging across the plains?
It seems like the most obvious candidate imaginable.
It does. But zebras are, frankly, terrifying. They've evolved for millions of years alongside lions, so they are hyper-alert, aggressive, and have a nasty fight-or-flight response.
And they bite.
They have a crushing bite, and unlike a horse, they don't let go. They also have this uncanny ability to duck under a thrown lasso. People have tried for centuries to tame zebras. It almost always ends in serious injury. They're just fundamentally untamable. The grizzly bear is another one. Big, strong, eats everything, but just way too nasty to live with.
Okay, so that's four. Number five is the tendency to panic.
Right. Some animals, like deer and gazelles, are just too flighty. If you put them inside a fence, their instinct when they're scared is to bolt blindly. They'll just smash themselves against the fence until they die of shock or break their neck.
You need an animal that herds up when it's scared.
Exactly. Like sheep or cattle. When they feel threatened, they bunch together, which makes them easy for a shepherd or a dog to control. If they scatter in every direction, they're useless.
And the final point, number six.
Social structure. The ideal candidate lives in a herd with a well-defined dominance hierarchy.
Why is that important?
Because humans can then hijack that social structure. We insert ourselves at the top of the hierarchy as the alpha leader, and the rest of the herd just follows its instincts and follows us. Animals that are solitary and territorial, like most rhinos or antelope, don't have that instinct. You can't become their leader.
So when you take this 6-point checklist and apply it to all the large mammal candidates around the world, the results are not even.
They are brutally unequal. Diamond did the math. He looked at the 148 wild, terrestrial, herbivorous mammal species in the world that weigh over 100 pounds. Those are the potential candidates for domestication.
And out of 148 candidates, how many passed all 6 tests?
Only 14? Just 14 species in the entire history of the world.
That is an incredibly small number.
And here's the real kicker. Where were those 14 animals located before humans started moving them around?
Let me guess. Eurasia.
Eurasia got 13 of the 14. They had the ancestors of cows, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, the whole package.
They won the biological lottery. What about the other continents?
South America had one. Just one. The ancestor of the llama and alpaca. North America, Australia, and sub-Saharan Africa. They had 0.
Wait, Africa had 0, with all those iconic big animals.
Every single one of them fails the Anna Karenina test. The African buffalo is too aggressive. The zebra is untamable. The rhino is solitary. The elephants take too long to grow. It's a continent full of magnificent wild animals that are, for one reason or another, completely undomesticable.
So a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia just had to look outside and see wild goats and sheep ready to be herded, while a farmer in southern Africa could look at a herd of zebra for 1,000 years and never ever get a beast of burden out of it.
That's the staggering unfairness of it all. And it's the exact same story with plants.
The crops were just as unevenly distributed.
Even more so, maybe. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East wasn't just lucky with animals. It was the jackpot for plants. It had the wild ancestors of wheat and barley.
And what's so special about wheat and barley?
They're basically miracle crops. They're incredibly high in protein, easy to grow, they can be harvested and stored for years as dry grain, and they're self-pollinating so the genetics are stable. It was a complete, ready-made package for intensive agriculture.
And you compare that to, say, New Guinea again.
The people of the New Guinea highlands invented agriculture all on their own. It was an incredible achievement. But what did their local environment give them to work with?
Taro roots and bananas.
Right. Which are low in protein, high in water content, so they rot quickly and are hard to store, and they're much more labor-intensive to cultivate.
So geography dealt the cards, and Eurasia got a royal flush of wheat, barley, cows, and horses.
Well, New Guinea got a pair of twos,
Huh.
and you simply cannot build a global empire on a foundation of taro roots with no draft animals to pull a plow. The system just doesn't scale up.
So we have the raw materials, the what. Now we need to talk about the spread, the where. This gets into Diamond's theory about the axes of the continents.
This might be the most elegant and mind-blowing idea in the whole book. If you just look at a world map, you'll notice the continents have different shapes.
Eurasia is wide. It's oriented east-west.
It's a long, horizontal landmass. The Americas and Africa, on the other hand, are tall. They're oriented north-south.
And this simple geometric fact has profound consequences for human history. Why?
Because of latitude. Locations at the same latitude anywhere on Earth share the exact same day length and seasonality. They also tend to have very similar climates, habitats, and diseases.
So a crop that was domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, like wheat,
Could spread east and west with relative ease. It could travel from modern-day Iran all the way to Ireland or to Japan because the climate it was moving through was fundamentally similar. The seeds would still germinate at the right time.
and it's the same for animals.
Mm.
A horse from the steppes of Central Asia can thrive in Europe.
Exactly. This meant that an innovation made in one part of Eurasia, whether it was a new crop, a domesticated animal, the wheel, riding, could diffuse rapidly across the entire continent. It became this massive, interconnected zone of exchange.
Now let's contrast that with the north-south axis.
It's a completely different story. If you try to move a crop from, say, Mexico north into the present-day United States, you are crossing latitudes. You're moving through drastically different climates.
You go from tropical to desert to temperate forest. The day length changes, the seasons change, the rainfall changes.
And that's a huge barrier for a plant. The corn that was domesticated in Mexico took literally thousands of years to genetically adapt its way north to be farmable in the Ohio River Valley.
And these barriers didn't just block crops, they blocked technology.
Absolutely. The classic example is the wheel and the llama. The wheel was invented in Mesoamerica. We see it on toys. The only large domesticable mammal in the Americas was the llama in the Andes.
But the two never met.
They never met. The dense, tropical, disease-ridden jungles of the Panamanian Isthmus formed an impenetrable barrier. So the wheel stayed in Mexico and the llama stayed in Peru. They were isolated pockets of innovation.
So while Eurasia was becoming this giant 8,000-mile-wide superhighway for ideas, germs, and technology,
The Americas and Africa were fragmented into a series of ecological islands with very slow and difficult diffusion between them. Eurasia just built up this incredible momentum, this huge head start, because of its shape.
which brings us to the moment of collision, when these two separate historical trajectories finally meet. This is the guns, germs, and steel of the title.
And the single best case study is the meeting at Cajamarca, November 16th, 1532.
This is the moment that crystallizes the whole argument. set the scene.
You have the Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro. He has a tiny, scraggly force of 168 soldiers. They've marched deep into the mountains of Peru, into the heart of the Inca Empire.
And waiting for them is the Inca emperor himself, Atahualpa.
And Atahualpa is not alone. He is at the head of a victorious army of 80,000 men.
So 168 versus 80,000. I mean, the odds are just astronomical. It should have been a complete wipeout for the Spanish.
It should have been, and yet within a couple of hours, thousands of Incas are dead on the ground. The emperor is Pizarro's prisoner, and not a single Spaniard has been killed.
How? What are the proximate causes? This is the how of the conquest.
The how is the package of advantages that Eurasia's geography had produced. First, the most obvious, steel.
Swords and armor.
The Spanish had steel swords, rapiers, and steel plate armor. The Incas had clubs made of stone or wood and armor made of quilted cotton. In a direct confrontation, a steel sword just slices through that. The Inca weapons literally couldn't penetrate Spanish armor.
Okay, so that's steel. Then you have the guns.
Our harquebuses. And Diamond makes the point that these were actually pretty primitive firearms. They were slow to load, wildly inaccurate. They didn't do most of the killing.
But the psychological effect must have been immense.
Immense. The noise, the smoke, the fire. To a people who had never conceived of such a thing, it seemed like the Spaniards were wielding thunder. It created terror and chaos.
But the real military game changer, he argues, wasn't the gun. It was the horse.
The horse. It was the tank of the 16th century. The Incas had never seen a human riding an animal before, let alone an animal that large and fast. A cavalry charge into a mass of infantry who have no anti-cavalry tactics. It's just devastating. It breaks their formations and their morale.
There's another piece of technology at play here, though, an invisible one, writing.
A crucial one. The Spanish had writing. Pizarro had read accounts of Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs a decade earlier. He was literally following a playbook for how to capture an indigenous leader through treachery.
He had access to thousands of years of recorded military history from across Eurasia.
Right, and Atahualpa. He had nothing. No written records. He had no information about the Spaniards, their tactics, or their intentions. He walked into an obvious trap because he had no system for recording and transmitting that kind of detailed information.
Okay, so steel, horses, guns, and writing explain the battle. But they don't explain how 168 men conquer an empire of millions. That requires something else.
That requires the silent, deadliest weapon of them all. Germs.
The lethal gift of livestock.
This takes us all the way back to the barnyard. The vast majority of our major infectious diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis, they're what we call crowd diseases. They evolved from diseases that originally affected our domestic herd animals.
Can you trace the lineage?
Sure. Measles is closely related to rinderpest, a disease of cattle. Smallpox is a mutation of cowpox. Influenza viruses constantly circulate between humans, pigs, and ducks.
So because Eurasians spent 10,000 years living in close, often unhygienic proximity to their farm animals.
The pathogens had thousands of years to make the jump from animals to humans. And over those millennia, the human populations of Eurasia were repeatedly devastated by these plagues, but the survivors passed on genes that conferred some resistance. They developed partial immunity.
But in the Americas,
They had no domestic herd animals, no cows, no pigs, no sheep. The llama isn't kept in dense herds indoors, so they had never been exposed to these specific microbes. They were immunologically naive.
a virgin population.
A completely virgin population. So when the first Europeans sneezed on the American continent, it was like a biological bomb going off.
And the diseases spread faster than the conquerors themselves.
Much faster. A smallpox epidemic swept through the Inca Empire before Pizarro even got there. It actually killed the previous emperor and one of his heirs, which triggered the very civil war between Atahualpa and his brother that Pizarro was able to exploit.
The numbers are just impossible to comprehend.
The estimates are that something like 95% of the pre-Columbian population of the Americas was wiped out by Old World diseases. In many parts of North America, the colonists arrived to find what they described as pristine, empty wilderness.
But it wasn't empty.
It was a graveyard.
Yeah.
The people who had lived there for centuries had just been wiped out by waves of disease that traveled ahead of the European frontier. It completely dismantles that heroic myth of conquest.
So let's bring this into the present. The book is about the fates of human societies, plural. How does this system map help us understand the world we live in today? Let's take Africa.
Africa is a perfect application of the model. You look at modern maps of wealth and development, and sub-Saharan Africa often lags behind. The old, discredited explanation was race. The slightly more modern one is to blame bad institutions or corruption.
But Diamond says you have to look at the underlying geography.
You have to. First, the north-south axis. It's a huge continent, but it's tall. That means the crops and livestock domesticated in the Fertile Crescent couldn't just spread south.
They hit the tropical barrier.
They hit the Sahara Desert, and then they hit the tropics with its different climate and diseases. It effectively walled off southern Africa from the Eurasian package of innovations for millennia.
And we already talked about the lack of native domesticates. No horses, no cattle.
And then you have the local diseases. The tsetse fly, which carries sleeping sickness, made it impossible to raise cattle or horses in a vast belt across Central Africa. Malaria was another huge factor.
But Diamond makes a really important point with the Bantu expansion.
He does, and it proves the theory. A few thousand years ago, a group of people in West Africa, the Bantu, developed their own agricultural package of yams and sorghum, and they developed iron metallurgy.
So they had their own version of guns, germs, and steel.
They did. And what happened? They exploded out of their homeland and expanded across almost all of sub-Saharan Africa over the next couple of thousand years.
And they displaced the previous inhabitants.
They displaced or absorbed the original hunter-gatherer populations, the Pygmies and the Khoisan. It's the exact same pattern we see everywhere else in the world. When a people has the advantage of food production and better technology, they expand at the expense of those who don't. It's not about race. It's about the power that comes from the environmental package.
Okay, but here's a fascinating twist. If the Eurasian landmass was the ultimate cradle of civilization, why did Europe, a small, messy peninsula on the western edge, end up dominating the world and not China?
Right. By all rights, it should have been China. They had a massive head start in so many areas. They had agriculture early, writing, cast iron, gunpowder, paper, the compass, all centuries before Europe.
So what happened? Why didn't Chinese ships conquer Europe?
Diamond's answer comes back to geography again, but in a much more subtle way. He calls it the fractured land hypothesis.
Yes, let's compare the maps. What does China's geography look like?
China is relatively smooth and connected. It has a fairly uniform coastline. It has two enormous navigable rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze, that flow east, creating a massive, fertile heartland. It's a landscape that is relatively easy to unify under a single ruler.
And that's what happened. China was unified into a single empire very early in its history.
Right, and for a long time, that unity was a huge advantage. But it also creates a single point of failure. If you have one emperor, and that one emperor makes one bad decision, that decision can halt progress across the entire civilization.
And the classic example of this is the treasure fleets.
In the early 1400s, the Chinese admiral Zheng, he commanded the greatest navy the world had ever seen. Huge ships, hundreds of feet long, that sailed all the way to Africa. They were decades, maybe centuries, ahead of Europe.
But they just stopped.
It just stopped. A power struggle at the imperial court led to a new emperor who saw the fleets as a wasteful extravagance. He issued an edict banning all ocean-going voyages. The shipyards were dismantled, the records were destroyed, and China turned inward.
And because it was one unified empire, there was nowhere else for an admiral to go.
Exactly. Now look at the map of Europe. It's the complete opposite of China.
It's a geographic mess.
A total mess.
Yeah.
It's fractured by major mountain ranges like the Alps and the Pyrenees. It's broken up into peninsulas, Italy, Greece, Iberia, Scandinavia. It has major islands like Britain. It was impossible to unify.
So it was never a single empire after the Romans.
Never. It remained a patchwork of dozens of competing, squabbling kingdoms and states, and this chronic disunity, which seems like a weakness, turned out to be its greatest long-term strength.
How so?
It fostered constant competition. If one king decided not to fund a new technology, say, a better cannon, he risked being conquered by his neighbor who did. There was no central authority that could just turn off the tap of innovation for the whole continent.
This is the Columbus story.
It's the perfect example. Columbus goes to the King of Portugal with his crazy idea to sail west to find Asia. The king's experts look at it and say no. If Europe were a unified empire like China, that would be the end of the story.
But it wasn't.
So Columbus just walked across the border and pitched his idea to the King and Queen of Spain, and they, partly because they were in fierce competition with Portugal, said yes. Europe's fragmentation ensured that somebody, somewhere, would always be willing to bet on a new idea.
So paradoxically, China's unity became a long-term disadvantage, while Europe's disunity was the engine of its relentless innovation.
Exactly. It's an incredible irony of geography.
Okay, let's tie this all back to the central theme of our channel, the crisis in perception. We started by saying that people look at the modern world, see these vast inequalities, and perceive it as a story of merit.
That is the crisis. We see the wildly different outcomes of history, and we invent stories about the superior culture or the superior intelligence or the superior work ethic of the winners.
But a book like Guns, Germs, and Steel forces you to look underneath that perception.
It forces you to see the system, to see that what we call European superiority was really just the end product of a 13,000-year head start, granted by a lucky combination of domesticable plants, domesticable animals, and an east-west continental axis.
It's an incredibly humbling perspective.
It has to be. It removes any basis for racial or cultural arrogance. Understanding the deep environmental reasons why one society developed guns and steel before another doesn't justify the conquests that followed.
If anything, it does the opposite.
It completely demolishes the racist pseudo-explanations that were used to justify those conquests in the first place, and that still, linger in our political discourse today.
So, the final thought experiment. If we could rewind the tape of history.
If you could go back to 11,000 BC, just as the Ice Age is ending, and you could perform a great swap. You take the ancestors of modern-day Aboriginal Australians, and you place them in the Fertile Crescent.
And you take the ancestors of modern Europeans and place them in Australia.
And you just let the tape run forward for 13,000 years.
What does the world look like in AD 1500?
The history would almost certainly be reversed. It would be the Aboriginals having domesticated the wheat and barley, the cows and sheep, and having spread their technologies east and west across Eurasia, who would have eventually built the steel ships.
And they would have been the ones to discover and conquer a continent of tribal Stone Age Europeans in Australia?
It's a profound idea. It suggests that history is not destiny, but it is powerfully constrained by the dirt under our feet.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. We've gone from a single question on a beach in New Guinea to the genetics of wheat, the domestication of the horse, and the shape of the continents themselves.
And we've really only been able to touch on the biggest ideas. The book itself is packed with so much more detail, so much evidence from archaeology, linguistics, genetics.
It is a monumental work, and we have to give full credit to Jared Diamond and his book Guns, Germs, and Steel. If this conversation has intrigued you, we strongly encourage you to read the full text. It's the kind of book that really does change how you see the map of the world.
It really does. It's a foundational text for this kind of systems thinking.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for listening.